Hey everybody, this video is called The Death of Elisha, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, and I did have to double check because we haven't heard of Elisha for quite a while, but this chapter is going to cover the death of Elisha today. And the other thing I want to point out here is many people hate going through the books of the Kings and the books of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In 1st and 2nd Kings, and we are halfway at this point through this study in 2nd Kings. But we're going to start out here in chapter 13, verse 1 through 4. It says, "In the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel in Samaria, and reigned 17 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. He did not depart from them. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he delivered them into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, all their days. So Jehoash pleaded with the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, because the king of Syria oppressed them." So the 23rd year that we look at here in verse 1 is speaking about 814 BC. And Joash of Judah began his reign in 835 BC, and Jehu of Israel died in 814 BC. And the one interesting thing, as we go through the book of 2 Kings, you're going to realize I'm throwing tons of names at you and tons of periods of years. So therefore, the 23rd year here of speaking of Joash of Judah was calculated according to the non-accession year system. And 17 years would have ranged from 814 to 798 BC, part of the 17 calendar years, with the actual reign counted as 16 years. And you can see Jeroboam's sins back in our video in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25 through 32 that we looked at back on January 27th. And this description of Jeroboam was one who made Israel sin occurs in verses 6 and 11, as well as in the book of 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 16, 1 Kings 15:30, 1 Kings 16:31, and 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 3. And there's even many more references with that. And remember that the Syrian king was Ben-Hadad here. And it's most likely speaking, when we see Ben-Hadad here, it's most likely speaking of the second, not the first or senior. Today we might call him junior. But we saw Jehoash followed in the footsteps of Jeroboam and his father Jehu. And Jehoash was an ungodly man who prayed, and God listened to him because God showed great mercy and because of his care for Israel. So we see that God listened to an ungodly man who prayed here. And in verse 5 through 9 says, "Then the Lord gave Israel a deliverer, so that they escaped from under the hand of the Syrians, and the children of Israel dwelt in their tents as before. Nevertheless, they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, who had made Israel sin, but walked in them. And the wooden image also remained in Samaria. For he left the army of Jehoash only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers, for the king of Syria had destroyed them, and made them like the dust at threshing. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoash, all that he did in his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Jehoash rested with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. Then Joash his son reigned in his place. So verses 5 through 9 here, the deliverer was not specifically named, and theologians argue that it may have been the Assyrian king Adad-nirari III between 810 through 783 BC, whose attack on the Syrians enabled the Israelites to break Syria's control over the Israelite territory. And it could have been Elisha or Jeroboam II between 793 and 753 BC, who was able to extend Israel's boundaries back into Syrian territory. And we are introduced here in verse number 6 to the wooden image. And the wooden image was an idol representing the false god Ashtoreth, the Canaanite goddess, and a consort of Baal had been set up by Ahab, as we saw about a month ago back in our study of 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 33, and had escaped the destruction by Jehu when he had purged the Baal worship from Samaria, as we saw just last week in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 27-28. And along with the other idolatrous religion of Jeroboam II, there were still remnants of Baal worship in the northern kingdom, and Syria was able to dominate Israel's military because the Lord had left Jehoash only a small army with a very few chariots. And Israel's army was so inconsequential, particularly when compared to the armies of Syria and the Assyria. And it was likened to the dust that was left over after grain had been winnowed at the threshing floor. In very like pattern of Book of Judges, where Israel slipped into apostasy, they were humbled under their enemies, and then they cried out to God. And we see that God showed mercy, and he sent a deliverer. And Israel was weak because of their lack of fellowship with the true God of Israel. In verse 10 through 13 says, "In the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, became king over Israel and Samaria, and reigned 16 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, but he walked in them. Now the rest of the acts of Joash, all that he did in his might, in which he fought against Amaziah, the king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Joash rested with his fathers. Then Jeroboam sat on his throne, and Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel." So verses 10 through 13, we see in verse 10, the 37th year would have been about 798 BC. And Joash of Judah began his reign in 835 BC. And there's a change here to the accession system, year system of Dayton for the reign of Joash of Judah. And this goes on to explain how Jehoahaz of Israel could reign 16 years with only a 15-year advance on Joash of Judah's regnal years. And Jehoash was king of Israel, who had the same name as his peer, the king of Judah. And 16 years speaks of 798 to 782 BC. And Jehoash continued some sins as his father and grandfather. In his reign, he saw a civil war break out under his kingship. And verse 14 says, "Elisha became sick with the illness of which he would die. Then Joash, the king of Israel, came down to him and wept over his face and said, O my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen. So in verse 14, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a sip of water. So in verse 14, since chapter 9, verse 1, we haven't seen Elisha mentioned, as I mentioned at the start of the video. And that was when Jehu was anointed king of Israel. And since Jehu and Jehoash reigned between the years of 841 to 798 BC, nothing was recorded for over 40 years of Elisha's life. And Elisha began ministering, as you recall from 1 Kings study and going into 2 Kings here. He worked with Elisha in ministering during the kingship of Ahaz during 874 to 853 BC, as we looked at about a month ago, like I said, in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 19 through 21. And so he must have been over 70 years of age when these final events of his life takes place. And Jehoash humbly voiced his great respect for Elisha and his dependence upon his counsel. And Jehoash acknowledged through this metaphor that the Lord, through Elisha, was the real strength and power of Israel against all her enemies. And Elisha passes on following sickness. And now, so Elisha died following this sickness. And now I know faith healers don't like this passage. You will not hear this being spoken about to them because, you know, in their little world, God heals everybody. But if you lack faith, that's the reason why you get sick and you die. And obviously I disagree with that theology these days, unlike years ago when I was wrapped up in it myself. But even the men of faith and miracles aren't immune to sickness and disease. Everybody's gonna die. It doesn't matter if you're Benny Hinn or any of these other wackos on TV that, you know, claim they can heal everybody and everything, but they never go up to children's hospitals. And my friend Brian Peckham, he's actually going through a great book in his Bible studies of Strange Fire by John MacArthur. And I enjoy John MacArthur's content with Strange Fire and approaching the charismatic chaos that we see today. And so Elisha, he became sick like others whom God healed through him. And God had appointed this illness, and already I got a faith healer screaming at me if they were to watch this, because I said God appointed Elisha's illness to be the means of taking Elisha from this earth. And not all the godly will die in their sleep without illness being the cause. Some people, they live in a luxury world where they think, you know, if you're godly, you're going to live 70, 80 years and you're going to die peaceably. You're going to die without sickness or any of these other things. But the way a person dies does not determine their eternal state. Some people are going to die horrific deaths, and they're going to be born again believers. And likewise, you're going to see some of the most wicked people that when they die, they're going to die in their sleep and peacefully. And so verse 15 and 17 to continue on here, it says, and Elisha said to him, take a bow and some arrows. So he took himself a bow and some arrows. Then he said to the king of Israel, put your hand on the bow. So he put his hand on it, and Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. And he said, open the east window, and he opened it. And Elisha said, shoot. And he shot, and he said, the arrow of the Lord's deliverance, and the arrow of the deliverance from Syria. For you must strike the Syrians at Aphek till you have destroyed them. So verses 15 through 17, Joash was concerned of the true strength of Israel was about to depart from this earth. And Elisha used this illustration of an arrow shot through the window to show him that the arrow of the Lord's deliverance was still present. And all Joash had to do was shoot the arrow in faith. In verse 16, it's a symbolic act that indicated Jehoash would assert power against the Syrians that came from the Lord through his prophet. And the east window opened towards the east, speaking to the Transjordan region controlled by Syria. And when Jehoash obeyed Elisha by shooting this arrow out of the window, the prophet interpreted the meaning for the action of the Lord's deliverance for Israel through the defeat of the Syrian army by Jehoash. And verse 18 and 19 says, "Then he said, 'Take the arrows.' So he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, 'Strike the ground.' So he struck 3 times and stopped. And the man of God was angry with him and said, 'You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Syria till you had destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times.'" So we see that Elisha commanded Jehoash only shot 3 arrows. Or we see that Elisha commanded Jehoash to shoot the remaining arrows into the ground, as Jehoash shot only 3 arrows into the ground instead of emptying the entire quiver. And because of his lack of faith, Jehoash would only win 3 victories over the Syrians instead of completely annihilating them, destroying them. And we'll see the account of these upcoming victories as we progress through the chapter here in verse 25. But verse 21 says, "Then Elisha died, and they buried him. And the raiding bands from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year. So it was as they were burying a man, and suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet." So verses 21, 22, the prophet who was the Lord's defense was dead. And it was the season for war campaigns, as it was very common for wars to start in the spring after the rains of winter. And how excited I am for spring myself, now that we are entering spring. Now, spring started. But, we just had a big snowstorm last week. So most of us up north were ready for springtime. Just not the allergies. But to continue on here, a dead man returned to life after touching Elisha's bones. And that's not really explainable to me. And this miracle was a sign that God's power continued to work in the relationship to Elisha even after his death. And what God had promised to Joash through Elisha when he was alive would surely come to pass after the prophet's death and the defeat of the enemy. And the recovery of the cities that had been taken and their restoration to the kingdom of Israel. And in verse 21, we see in the most strange and unusual miracle of the Bible. And it was a very unique one-time thing that we see to bring honor to the memory of this great prophet. And, the man's healed by touching the dead prophet's bones, as verse 21 says. So it was as they were burying a man that suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood onto his feet. And so verse 22 and 23 to continue here says, And Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoash. But the Lord was gracious to them, had compassion on them, and regarded them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not yet destroy them or cast them from his presence. So verses 22-23, during this wicked reign of Jehoash, the Lord was patient, and God did not bring the ultimate military defeat that would have led Israel to exile. And this was because of his agreement with the patriarchs to give their descendants of the land, as we saw back in the book of Genesis chapter 5, verse 18 through 21, Genesis chapter 26, verses 2 through 5, and Genesis chapter 28, verse 13 through 15. And it was God's promise, not the Israelites' goodness, that motivated God to show mercy and compassion toward Israel. And verse 25 says, Now Hazael, king of Syria, died. Then Ben-Hadad his son reigned in his place. And Jehoash, the son of Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, recaptured from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken out of the hand of Jehoahaz, his father, by war. 3 times Joash defeated him and recaptured the cities of Israel. So, it's the same with our salvation. To take a step back to verse 23, God showing mercy and compassion, not based off of Israel's righteousness or anything good that they did, but because of God's goodness and his sovereign will. And likewise, God is the same with us. God shows us mercy and compassion to whom he chooses, as Romans 9 tells us. And Elisha had promised Joash these 3 victories over the Syrians. And after the 3rd victory, King Joash likely wished that he had shot more arrows through the window at the invitation of Elisha. But to wrap up here, we're going to do a quick wrap up again. And we look today at the summary of the reign of Jehoahaz and an answer to prayer. And we look at the rest of Jehoahaz's reign, the summary of his reign over Israel. And we looked at Elisha's sickness unto death and probably upset some faith healers. But we looked also at King Joash and his final audience with Elisha the prophet. And we see that King Joash failed to fully take the opportunity. And we saw the continuing power of God at work in Elisha even after his death. The prophet Elisha made an impact even when he was dead. And we saw God's kindness to Israel in the ending, where the king got 3 victories against the Syrians. And that is why faith is important. We must have faith. You cannot please God without faith. And, when we don't have faith, there's likely to bring some trials behind it. But we'll see you next, as we're going to be looking at the reigns of Amaziah and Jeroboam II in chapter 14 next. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and we'll see you next time.